As the puck was put into the center for the St. Louis Blues to score, there was a violent collision between their forward, Steve Tuttle, and the Sabres defender, knocking down the Sabres goalie, Clint Malarchuk, in the process. The contact itself didn't seem like anything out of the ordinary for an NHL game, but as Clint collapsed to the ground, clutching at his throat, it quickly became clear that the collision was far worse than it first appeared. As Clint lay on the ice, a dark red puddle started to form in front of him, growing larger with each beat of his heart. In the chaos of the collision, as Steve Tuttle was flipped onto his back, his blade had cut open Clint's throat, completely severing his jugular. The players on both teams screamed for medical assistance. Seeing the blood spill onto the ice, some fans started fainting in the stands. 3 of the players vomited, and there were even reports of 2 fans experiencing heart attacks at the confronting sight. It was total chaos, and it all happened so quickly. The referee called for a stretcher, announcing that Clint was bleeding to death. It seemed like all hope was lost. The red pool was getting bigger, and a severed jugular would usually be fatal in minutes. But the team's athletic trainer, Jim Pizzatelli, rushed in and attempted to save Clint's life. And it's a good thing Jim was there, because, as shocking as it might be, it wasn't the first life-threatening injury that Jim had been confronted with. Being a former Vietnam combat medic, Jim was no stranger to seeing blood. And so, keeping a level head, he reached into the wound, he pinched off the bleeding vein, and he took control of the situation. Clint started begging Jim to get him off the ice, away from the cameras. Jim thought it was a strange request given the gravity of his situation, but what he didn't realize is that Clint had already resigned himself to dying. Clint knew that his mother would be watching the game on TV, and thinking only of her, he desperately didn't want his mother to watch her son die on the ice. Jim tried to comfort Clint as much as he could, while holding his life in his hands, and he held Clint together as they rushed off to the hospital. By the time they got Clint into the emergency room, he had lost a quarter of the blood in his body. But when the doctors saw the wound, it wasn't just the jugular they were concerned about. As they looked closer, they realized that the carotid artery, which supplies oxygenated blood to the brain, was only a millimeter away from also being severed, which, if it had been cut, would have ended Clint's life almost immediately. The doctors operated, Clint received 300 stitches to close the wound, and within days he was out of the hospital, hugging his mother once again. Everyone thought that Clint's life had been saved, and he was even back out on the ice 4 days after the injury. However, as an X-ray would show years later, this was just the start of Clint's problems. Seeing Clint on the ice less than a week later and then back in goal during a game only 10 days after the injury surprised everyone who had witnessed the horrific moment. But when speaking to news reporters, Clint tried to reassure everyone that he was in fact okay. As Clint put it, when you fall off a horse, you get back on right away, before your fear can get the better of you. Ever since he was little, Clint always wanted to appear strong and capable. He didn't see himself as someone with much talent, but he felt he could always push through and outperform those around him with sheer grit and determination. He was a perfectionist, so much so that he'd obsessively overwork himself to the point of being hospitalized and having mental and physical breakdowns as he anguished over his pursuit of perfection. So Clint's mother wasn't surprised when she saw her son back in the rink so soon. He skated back out onto the ice to a standing ovation from the Buffalo fans, and he was treated like a hero. But despite what it seemed on the surface, Clint's decision to return so quickly wasn't just about his pursuit of perfection or in braving his fear of death head on. In fact, it was partly because he was succumbing to a different fear, the fear of losing everything he'd built. See, around the time of Clint's injury, his contract with the Sabres was up for renewal, and he feared that if he didn't return to the ice and prove to his team that his near-death experience hadn't weakened him, he wouldn't get re-signed and his career would be over. Clint kept up his tough guy exterior for the rest of the season, and he successfully secured a contract renewal. But while Clint's physical injuries seemed to heal quickly, the psychological trauma of everything that had happened only got worse. As the following season began, Clint returned to the rink, and gradually, cracks started to appear. As he stood there on the ice with the play surging towards him, in his mind he saw players flip and blades slice his throat again. Game after game, play after play, as the chin strap on his helmet dragged back and forth along the scar tissue on his throat, the flashbacks started overtaking his mind. After the games, he'd go straight home. the panic attacks and anxiety becoming so overbearing that he couldn't even celebrate the wins. Even at night, he couldn't get any rest, as nightmares kept him awake. And then, one night after drinking at a Super Bowl after-party, he was sitting at home reading a bottle of painkillers that he'd been prescribed after breaking his thumb. When he looked at the bottle, he saw that it said the pills would cause drowsiness if mixed with alcohol. What was supposed to be a warning, to a desperately sleep-deprived Clint, it felt like a way to finally get some rest. So, he took 5 pills and went to bed. When Clint woke up, he looked around and the room felt strange, yet oddly familiar. He was back in hospital again. This time, even closer to death than he'd been before. The doctors told Clint that his heart had stopped, and they asked him if he'd been trying to end his own life. He assured them that he hadn't, and he opened up about all the struggles he'd been having. And as they dug through his life experiences as a child all the way through to his hockey career, they diagnosed him with a few things: anxiety, depression, and even OCD. But despite what seems in retrospect to be an obvious diagnosis, Clint wasn't diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. Despite this oversight, Clint started to finally actually receive some medical care, and his mental health started to stabilize. Clint ended his career as a player and he began coaching local teams, eventually making his way back to coaching teams in the NHL. 20 years passed since his injury, and so at this point it seemed like it was all well and truly in the past. The traumatic memories still flashed into Clint's mind on occasion, but for the most part he was able to live a relatively normal life. That was until February 2008. Clint was sitting at home watching the broadcast of a game between his old team, the Buffalo Sabres, and a team he used to coach, the Florida Panthers. The Sabres were up by 1 goal and it was a close match, but as there was a clash on the ice and the camera panned to follow the play, Clint's heart started to pound as he listened to the commentator's frantic words.
Oh my goodness!
Oh my God, he's bleeding bad.
Richard Zednik is cut wide open. Oh my God. This is very serious.
Buffalo has seen something terrible in past years. Fortunately, Clint Malarchuk is alive and well to talk about it today.
As Clint watched with gritted teeth, they replayed the moment it happened on the TV. And there he was again, the flashbacks intensifying and an intense dread washing over him. It felt like hours until an announcement finally came over the PA system.
Richard Zednik is in stable condition.
Wow.
Making the announcement on the PA that he's in stable condition.
It was a temporary relief. Richard Zednik was treated at the hospital and he was okay. But as every media outlet in the country suddenly started calling Clint to talk about his past, he started reliving his trauma all over again. Through the year, Clint continued to spiral, losing control of the level-headed self he'd worked so hard to cultivate years earlier, until, in October, while sitting on the back porch with his wife, Clint's erratic, intrusive thoughts, along with his tendency to self-medicate with alcohol, caused him to do something even he couldn't have foreseen. While standing in front of his wife, Joni, he turned his rifle around, pointed it under his own chin, and he pulled the trigger. Initially, in interviews, Joni described the incident as a hunting accident. But over the years, more details of the story started to come out, and it was later revealed that Clint's last words before he pulled the trigger were that he wanted to turn his head off. However, miraculously, Clint survived. Joni called 911, Clint was rushed to the hospital once again, and after operating, the doctor informed them that the bullet had gone through his chin, splitting his tongue, smashing a tooth, through the roof of his mouth, and had lodged itself in his sinus pathway, stopping it from damaging his eyes or his brain. After this harrowing moment, Clint finally started seeking out the help he desperately needed. He went into rehab and he got sober. He was finally, after 20 years, diagnosed with PTSD from his injury in 1989. Initially, Clint resisted the PTSD diagnosis, still desperately holding on to his tough guy image of himself. But Joni helped him come to terms with the diagnosis, and he finally got some professional help. Clint got better, and now he's an advocate for mental health, speaking publicly about his own battles with PTSD and depression, and inspiring others all over the world to reach out for help and not suffer in silence like he did.